Welcome everyone to another episode of Nikon TV. It is the first episode of 2022 and hopefully I'm going to have a really good one for you today. So what are we talking about? Well, in a few minutes, I'm going to be doing an interview with Brad Hill. This is photographer Brad Hill, biologist Brad Hill, tour leader, blog writer Brad Hill. He's been on Nikon TV before. He's going to come back to go and talk about some of his thoughts on the Z9 that he's been playing with for the last couple months, the Z100 to 400, the 24 to 120, and I know he's going to have some things to say about this new Z 400mm because this is also something that we're going to be talking about today. This was just announced last week, and we're going to be going through some of the info on this, but I'm going to start off the episode on a lens that's kind of squeaked by, and it's the new 28 to 75 f2.8 4RZ system. Now, right off the bat, you might think this is a bit of a weird lens because there already is a bit of a crowd in the 20 to 70-ish zoom bracket. We have the 24 to 70 f4 S-line lens. We have the 24 to 120 f4 S-line lens. We have the 24 to 70 f2.8 S-line lens. And now we have the 28 to 75 f2.8. Now, one of the big distinctions between this and the others is it is not S-line. Okay, so not S-line, what does that mean? Well, what I would essentially think of it is in terms of image quality, it reacts and gives photos very similarly to its 24 to 70 f2.8, the E version, the VR, on the F-mount side of things. So one characteristic I would say with all S-line lenses, most Z lenses entirely, is you can shoot wide open with very little to no penalty in terms of sharpness, in terms of center, corner. It's very, very even across the entire frame, even when shot wide open. Well, DSLR lenses, everybody knows, you always had to stop down to get the best critical sharpness. Well, you're gonna find that same quality with the 28 to 75. Now, okay, if you're a landscape photographer, if you're an astro photographer and you want the corners to be absolutely pin sharp, wide open, well, then I would recommend one of the other lenses, the 24 to 70 f4, the 24 to 120, or for astro particularly, whether it's a prime, Z20mm comes to mind, or the 24 to 70 2.8. If you need ultimate image quality, then I would go and look at some of the other options. But when you look at the size of this, the size, the weight of a 2.8 lens. So if you're an event photographer, you don't care about edge sharpness. You want center sharpness. And this lens has tons of it, even shot wide open. It may not be as good as the Z24 to 70 2.8, but for like half the price, that is a really, really good value of what you're getting. So that's really what I would consider when looking at the 28 to 75 is what type of photographer are you? What are your needs? What do you currently have that you aren't happy with that this could maybe fill the void of? Because if you're looking for that shallow depth of field, if you're looking to shoot maybe some family portraits from the 50 to 75 millimeter on area, well, that's really where this lens comes in because it is f2.8. And even though it is considerably cheaper than some of the other options, when you compare, let's say, this versus the 24 to 120 f4, you might think, okay, well, the 24 to 120, if you shoot them both at f4, then they'll be identical, some people would think. Well, the 28 to 75, even though it's stopped down to f4, the bokeh is a little bit better than what you would get from the other kind of 24 to 70, 24 to 120 range. So that's one nice benefit is if you care about the bokeh, go about this. If you care about the size of the weight, well, then you're going to look at the 28 to 75. And that's really kind of how you have to think about this lens is what are your ultimate needs? What are your ultimate goals? What do you already have? And does this have a place? Now, moving on from the 28 to 75, let's now go over to the Z 400mm f2.8 TCVR S-line lens. This is the latest, well, this is the first, I'll say, Z prime super telephoto lens that we now have. And one of the really impressive things about this lens is, yes, you obviously have a 400mm f2.8, that's a given. But do you have a built-in teleconverter? Because that TC in that long name stands for built-in teleconverter. So you have a 1.4 teleconverter built right in, which gives you a 560 mil equivalent at f4. Really impressive now because you're getting multiple lenses in one. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the different photographers that this could fit in terms of customers, because I'm having Brad Hill on and I know he's interested in this lens. I'm going to let him go and talk about that. I want to go and talk about a few of the techie aspects of this lens. The first being the weight. Now, when you actually pick this up, I can tell you right now, if anybody who's watched Nikon TV for years, since its inception a couple years ago, well, you're familiar with Mark Cruz. Mark Cruz will never use this lens. And do you know why? Because it doesn't give him enough of a bicep workout. It is just not heavy enough for him to go and want to pick up and carry around because he can't flex as much with it. So right off the bat, you're a 20% lighter with this version versus the FL F-mount version that we had for the DSLRs. So that's almost 900 grams lighter. If you go and throw a teleconverter on the old DSLR version, you're 1,000 grams lighter with this than the old version. That in itself is incredible. And then we start talking about image quality. To be honest, I'm not even really going to talk about it because image quality, you get what you expect from this lens. It is spectacular. Unbelievable fall off from what's in focus to what's out of focus. It is just so buttery smooth because of that 2.8. Really unbelievable image quality. And to help with that, we basically threw the kitchen sink at this in terms of all the different types of elements. We have two ED elements. We have a super ED element. We have two fluorite lens elements, which is partially why we're able to make it so much smaller and lighter. And then we also have an SR element. That's a short wavelength refractive element that we first introduced with, I believe, the 120 to 300. So we've basically thrown everything at this to make sure it's as sharp as it can be, it's as small as it can be, and that you have the lack of chromatic aberration that you would expect from a lens at this kind of pro top tier level. Now, there are a couple other small pieces of technology I want to kind of touch on very quickly. One of them is the new motor. So we have a new voice coil motor, VCM, within this lens. Up until this point, all of our NIKKOR Z lenses have all been STM lenses. Some of them the dual STM, where you have dual motors to kind of help move the elements around. But this new Silky Swift, it's SS VCM, this new VCM motor is really impressive from a few aspects. Right off the bat, people think, okay, well, it's got to be faster. Well, it is very fast, but it's not actually the speed that's so incredibly important. It's the acceleration and the de-acceleration, because what you notice with a lens of this size is you have very large lens elements that need to be moved around. And yes, you can get the speed up, but how quickly can you get that speed up? And that's really where the VCM motor within the 400mm comes into its own, because it's incredibly fast to not only get up to speed, but it also stops very quickly as well. And that is as important as how quickly you can get up to speed. Now, one other thing I won't really touch on, there's so much impressive aspects of we call it an optical encoder. It's essentially a digital ruler, and it allows the camera to be, or the lens, to be very, very precise, but also very accurate. Now, those two things are actually different. So you can be accurate without being precise, you can be precise without being accurate, or you can be both at the same time. And this lens is both at the same time, which means it can hit the same mark over and over and over again. So that precision and that accuracy, when you combine them together, means that the autofocus is always going to be bang on. It's always going to be exactly where you want it to be. And because of the speed of that motor, it's always going to be as fast as you want. Now, one last little bit that I will talk about is a coating. Now, you're probably familiar with nano crystal coating. We've had this for a number of years now. You're probably familiar with our neo coating, a new coating we've introduced lately with some of the top tier lenses we've come out with in the last couple of years. Well, we now have a brand new coating for the new Z 400mm, and that is a mesoamorphous coating. I'm not going to get into the super techie aspects of what makes it so good. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you guys with it. But all I'm going to say is that it is going to be as good and better than Nano and our Neo combined, which basically means that in any situation that you're shooting it, whether you're backlit completely, whether you have the sun in some of the frame, whether it's off to the side, you are not going to have any ghosting or flaring. So backlight shooting with this lens means that you are going to have really, really high image quality, which is what you would expect from a lens of this caliber. So mesomorphous coating, we have the new SSVCM. It is 900-ish grams lighter. So really, really light, really, really fast. Accelerates fast. The optical image quality is unlike anything. And with that built-in teleconverter, you're able to go from a 400 to a 560 mil lens with the flick of a switch. And the nice thing is on the positioning of where this is, if this was actually on a body, you don't even need to not only move your eye off the viewfinder, you don't even need to move your fingers off of its shooting position. It's just, oh, I need to have it unlocked first. You need to just go flick, and you're all set to go. You're now at 560 and you're now back to 400. So it's a very, very simple operation of the Z 400 millimeter, getting it with its teleconverter on or off. And one of the nice things is this can actually use additional teleconverters if you need. So not that I would really recommend using the built-in with the others, but let's say you have a 2x. You want to turn this into an 800 millimeter lens, well, go pop that Z200 2x teleconverter on here and make sure that the internal one is turned off, and you now have an 800 millimeter lens all in one package. 400, 560, and 800. Really, really impressive. Okay, so now let's move on, because I know you guys care about the 400, but not everybody wants to know about it. I know some of you care about the 28 to 70, but not everybody wants to hear about it. But I know that most people who are talking or are with me today probably want to go and hear from Brad Hill, because if you want to go and check out his site, I'm going to make sure that it's going to be in the comments below. Make sure you go and ask your questions to Brad, and we'll go and make sure that they're answered over the next little while, because he's just an absolute wealth of knowledge when it comes to not only the gear that he has already had in the past, but new gear like the 24 to 120 that he recently bought, the Z100 to 400 he recently bought, or his new Z9. So there's a lot of information that I'm hoping I'll be able to get from him, and hopefully you'll find it interesting too. So let's find out what he thinks. So Brad, thanks very much for coming back to Nikon TV. I'm glad I didn't scare you away the last time you were on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. And no major aftershocks on my end, so I managed to live through it.
That's good. Now, before we actually get started, I want to actually tell the viewers what we're going to be doing today is obviously a relatively quick interview between myself and Brad. Brad, you've had the camera, the Z9, and a number of the lenses for a couple months now. So I kind of want to pick your brain on those topics, but I also want to let everybody know that starting probably third week of February, we're thinking, we want to be, Brad and myself want to go and do a longer form discussion where it's not necessarily just me asking him questions. We actually want to interact with you guys, the viewers. So keep on the lookout on Nikon Social, keep on the lookout on Brad's blog page, which I will make sure is thrown into the comments multiple times during this interview. And just keep an eye out, because it'll probably be about an hour and a bit, depending on how into it you guys are. But this is the time to kind of, or will be the time to pick Brad's brain, pick my brain on how we set the camera up, what we kind of think about the settings, how we have our cameras really kind of on the minutia side. Because today I'm going to try and keep it a little bit more on the wide end of things, because the camera's been out for a little bit. The Z120 to the 24 to 120, the Z100 to 400 has been out for a little bit. So those aren't brand new topics. So I'm going to kind of try and get some more wider scope ideas from Brad about his thoughts on the camera and how it's kind of evolving his system. So Brad, let's kind of jump into it, because when we came out with the Z9, you and I talked quite a bit when it came out, and there was a lot of hype on the autofocus side of things. I'm partially to blame for that. I totally realize that. But my question to you is, once you actually got the camera in your hand and you were shooting with it, were you impressed with it as much as you expected to be or hoped to be? Did it kind of live up to your expectations?
Great question, Chris. And yes, Absolutely. It lived up to my expectations and in many ways exceeded them. I've historically always been a person who was a little bit reluctant to hand too much control over to the camera itself in terms of the autofocus function. And had been a single point. Of course, I'd use dynamic areas in the appropriate situations, but using 3D tracking or using auto area AF were things when I was back in the DSLR world that didn't appeal to me. And since getting the Z9, first the pre-production model to test for a good month, then my own, I found that I'm getting much more comfortable in handing autofocus over, and it is doing a better job than I could have done historically doing something like using single point or dynamic 9-point and toggling the focus bracket throughout the viewfinder. So yeah, it's absolutely exceeded my expectations, which I believe most people are finding, certainly based on the feedback I'm directly getting. People are blown away with how well the autofocus is working. So
yeah, and I think it's really, impressive, because most of the time the hype does not actually equal what the users are experiencing. And myself, obviously, I always try and kind of temper it. I love the Z9, but I also try and temper myself down a little bit, because I know that I maybe take a little bit more time to know the system. I obviously am well steeped in all Nikon universe. So I also don't want to just take my experience and put that on that everybody is going to have that same amazing experience. But I love that once I've saw more and more of the reviews on YouTube, on, let's say, your blog, where it was kind of echoing exactly what I was seeing. I kind of went, whew, okay, that's really good that the camera's living up not just to my hype, but to the expectations that everybody else had as well. So I really love that. Now, one thing that I think also hype-wise, that the Z9 was kind of put out there as, was it's Nikon's first flagship mirrorless camera. And the connotation that comes along with a flagship is you can take this camera anywhere. This is not something to be babied. And I think that, I hope you agree that the Z6, the Z7, the Z6 II, the Z7 II, that they even lead up to that you can take them pretty much anywhere thought as well. But the flagship really kind of tries to hammer that home. So you've had this for a while. You live out in the middle of nowhere, and you get some very cold weather. In terms of that difficult usage, because obviously the EVF is on all the time, the LCD screen is on if the EVF isn't. So you would think that the battery drain would be huge. You'd only get 15-20 minutes worth of battery life out of this. But in your experience, what do you find in cold weather with the Z9?
Yeah, to test cold weather performance in the camera, I was very fortunate that between Christmas and New Year's, we had a horrendous cold snap. So I was able to get out with it a lot. And I took advantage of that, not only in just going out and shooting a lot in the cold weather, but also even at times leaving it outside for a period of 3 or 4 hours with the camera on and making sure it was frozen when I went out and did some images. And so I have
to ask, did you do that with the sample I sent you, or with your own sample?
Oh, no, that was mine. Good question. No, it was interesting, though, in that, as you know, if you look at the operating specifications and the specs of on Nikon's websites, it indicates that, it's going to work to -10 Celsius, which for someone living in Florida, that may seem like, well, way beyond what we ever need. But I was out during that week. It was never above -18 and never below about -30. And I had sessions that lasted up to 4 hours with the camera outside in those conditions. And one thing I did not do was sort of go out and make note every day of how many images I was getting. But the bottom line is, the longest session I had was 4 continuous hours at -28. And I went out and shot, when I went out, I did note that day where my battery was at. It was sitting up at 89%. And I went out and shot. I was out on snowshoes, and I was using the 120 to the 24 to 120 lens quite extensively, as well as the 100 to 400 when the occasion suited, and a few bursts with good old Poncho, my test subject. And I shot over 500 images in that time, in the 4 hours. And when I got back, I checked the battery, and we were sitting at 71% power. So after 4 hours with the camera frozen the entire time. It wasn't going in a warm pack. It was going on a holster on my waist that was at ambient temperature. So in that regard, I was, because I was concerned about this aspect of its performance, because what I did during that time isn't atypical for what I do with the flagship camera. And it held up just fine. And so I haven't had a chance yet to test it in moist conditions, but based on how I know it's sealed, I'm expecting, and the fact that it's labeled a flagship, I'm expecting it to do just as well as my D6 ever did, which was phenomenal, in those conditions.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. And it really kind of goes to show that the specifications you read online, or maybe the previous thoughts you've had about mirrorless cameras, don't necessarily transfer over to the newest generation of cameras, especially the Z9. Now, there's been a lot of talk on the Z9 over the last number of months. It's won awards before it even was shipping. So a lot of people are aware of the Z9, but there hasn't been as much talk about the new NIKKOR Z lenses. At the same time, we had the 24 to 85, or sorry, the 24 to 120. Have already talked about the new 24 to 75 f2.8. We won't discuss that here because you haven't kind of played with it yet, but you've played with the 24 to 120, the Z 100 to 400, and I know that you are very interested in this. This was just announced last week. This is the Z 400 millimeter f2.8, and I already talked about the techie stuff of it. So, kind of from a wildlife naturescape kind of perspective, where do you see this lens fitting into either your bag or into other people's bags?
Yeah, this one, I have to shoot Nikon for introducing this lens, because I'm going to have to take out a second mortgage on my house. That being said, Chris, this lens to me, I've shot, as you know, historically, I've owned 400 millimeter f2.8 lenses, both the G and the E version, and loved them, and have found them to be an incredibly great tool for the kind of photography I do. So when I heard that they were adding on the 1.4 TC, in my head I instantly thought, well, this solves the problem of having a 400 2.8 with me, as well as I'll call it an almost 600 f4 with me, because we're at 560 millimeters, which, if you wanted in Photoshop, you could upsize that to a 600 without any problem with respect to the number of pixels dedicated to your subject. And then when I found out, of course, that the lens is compatible with the NIKKOR Z teleconverters, including the 2X. So I have functionally an 800 millimeter f5.6 with me as well. I'm looking going, wow, this is kind of the one-size-fits-all prime lens for a wildlife photographer, especially for one that focuses on the kinds of subject I do, which tends to be the marine mammals and large carnivores. I can certainly see where a bird photographer might be a little bit more, chuffed about the 800 f6.3 that has been pre-announced in terms of the development announcement. But for a lot of the wildlife photographers I know, this is ultimately, the allure of this 400 2.8 TC is very compelling. And to hear that it's coming in at 6.5 pounds, and so it's gone on a diet while adding a teleconverter, is a little bit it's too tempting, Chris.
Well, I will say on behalf of Nikon, I do apologize, but at the same time, I'm kind of okay that it's here. Now, kind of what you brought up, where you mentioned a number of different lenses. They were all prime lenses, and this is kind of one of the biggest back and forths between a lot of photographers, is prime versus zoom. And there's always going to be a back and forth, but I think, I hope that in your testing of the new Z 100 to 400, one of the things I think we've seen over the last number of years, whether it's the 180 to 400, the 120 to 300, even the 200 to 500 to some degree,
Yeah, I
the
agree.
image quality of the zoom lenses has really gotten much closer to kind of the pinnacle of where the prime lenses are, because there used to be a very, very large gap, and you shot primes to get the ultimate image quality. But now you kind of have to decide of, well, I'm getting close to that image quality with the zooms and I'm getting the versatility. So kind of, can you kind of give me an idea on your thought process with the Z 100 to 400? And because you've had that for you, I was able to send you one and now you have your own. So you've had a decent chunk of time to play with it. How do you figure that fitting into your own bag?
Yeah, well, it's a great question because, in a sense, I feel like I've entered reverso world with respect to going, having historically having all long primes and then having in my shorter focal ranges having more zooms. And I'm at the point now in the Z system as I transition over where, and really at the last year or two of the DSLR era, I was shooting, the 180 to 400, the 120 to 300, and just tickled pink with the quality. But now in the Z lines, I'm finding I'm loving their short focal length primes, and I'm at the same time I'm looking at the longer zooms. And so where does the 100 to 400 fit in? Well, for me, it's almost a perfect, it doesn't replace, in my particular case, some of the other higher end lenses. So for instance, the 400-2.8 that's coming out, it doesn't replace that lens necessarily. But what it does do is it gives me on expeditions where I may be very weight constrained, it gives me the ability to bring that along with a 500 PF for that matter, and be in a situation where I cover a focal range extremely well, but without compromising quality.
Right.
And you do have to accept that as a variable aperture zoom, I can't replicate a 400 millimeter f2.8 shot at f2.8. However, when I get into the overlapping apertures, so I'm shooting at 400 millimeters f5.6 and smaller, I'm looking at such a minimal difference in quality in that range that it's a welcome part of my kit. Also, if I'm out just for a day of hiking, if I could take that lens along, put it in a pouch on my hip, as well as the 24 to 120, I'm covering from 24 to 400 in the most portable kit imaginable. And I'm not, yes, I don't have that super wide aperture, but at the same time, in all the other ranges, I've got quality that's comparable, and it gives me such a nice portable outfit. So it complements, in my case, the other, some of the other lenses, whether they are a 180 to 400 or whether they're a 400-2.8, the new one with the TC integrated into it. So it's definitely earned a place in my kit. And as you know, I've tested it pretty extensively, and the difference in those, in the sharpness and the autofocus zones in those overlapping apertures is very minimal. So.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly incredibly impressive how, well, don't get me wrong, it still is a relatively expensive lens. It's over 3,000 Canadian dollars. So I know that it is not chump change, but the fact that the image quality coming out of that lens is rivaling some of the kind of exotic level lenses is really, really cool. It allows people to get access to that quality while, like you said, having the versatility of a zoom. Yes, you're losing out on the maximum aperture, but most people are okay with that because they may not want to or be able to carry around this big of a lens to get f2.8. So I think it's really interesting. Now, I also think that Nikon is well, you should yell at me because you said that you really like the primes on the lower end of things. Well, we've also come out with the 24 to 120. So this is now giving you more gear to kind of love and to try and fit into your bag because, like you said, if you have the 24 to 120, the 100 to 400, just those two lenses alone gives you a 24 to 400 range. And you're loving so far, you're loving the quality out of that 24 to 120, right?
Absolutely. You know, historically, I've always loved the concept of a 24 to 120 lens. I've thought that, the old, people love the idea of the trinity of the, having a 24-70 with a 70 to 200 with a 14 to 24 or 14 to 28, those kinds of ranges. But I've always thought, wow, if we can have a 24 to 120 that offers good quality throughout its focal range, including edge sharpness, and including good contrast throughout the entire range, then that's like a little dream lens in terms of what you can do with it. Especially as a nature photographer, you're covering from landscape lens to short telephoto. You may shoot me for saying this, Chris, but historically with the F-mount versions of them, I have to admit that after about 95 millimeters and above, thereabouts, I found the edge sharpness not really to be there in the F-mount versions. And so as a picky guy, I think I bought every copy of the 24 to 120, and I was hopeful, and they never really delivered to the degree that I would have liked. Now, the minute I got the 24 to 120 F4S, the new Z mount version, the first thing I did was test it at 70 millimeters against several lenses, at 100 millimeters against several lenses, and at 120 millimeters. And I had two primary things I wanted to check out. Number one, by far, was edge sharpness. And it came through strong as can be. Its edges at the longer focal lengths, and I knew they'd be sharp at the short focal lengths, but I wanted to test it at the longer focal lengths, and they came through fine. And the second thing I was concerned about is how does it hold contrast? And it holds contrast extremely well. So yeah, I'm tickled pink over that lens. And it's finally a 24 to 120 that's delivering the promise that I've always wanted on a 24 to 120. And yeah, it's definitely earned a place in my day-to-day kit. And I can imagine, I'm thinking of already being people asking me what lenses I'm taking on specific photo tours this coming season. And every time the 24 to 120 is listed, I might throw in a 51.2 on certain trips where I know that I'll be in situations, or maybe the 85-1.8 Z mount as well. But it's become a staple already in my kit. It's like, nope, the 24 to 120 is coming. One little tiny point that matters to people like me in the field is that it's also tremendously nice that when you're in weight constrained trips, that a lens like that is got the same filter thread as the 100 to 400 as the 70 to 200. So I'm invariably taking a circular polarizer with me, and sometimes a variable ND filter, or rather a very ND. And in those cases, I can take just one, and so I can, have, maybe it means, I can bring something else along on the trip as well, because I'm on weight constrained trips, float planes, helicopters, etc. So there you go.
Yeah, and you one thing I always like about your blog is you always point out everything you've just said from the time we started till now. It's always been very based around your needs, and whenever you read your blog, it's not as if you're going and saying the 100 to 400 should be in every single person's bag, or the 24 to 120 should be in every person's bag. But I love how you kind of always frame it as, these are my requirements, and does the lens fit those requirements, or is it outside of those? And that's kind of the nice thing I like reading about your blog, is it's not a black and white, it's good or bad. It's for my needs, will it work? And if it does, these are the reasons why. If it doesn't, these are the reasons why. And you really try and explain everything, all of your testing, all of your examples that you show, in a way that lets people make up their own mind, so that they aren't going and watching and just being like, oh, Brad says this lens sucks, that's it, I shouldn't buy it.
Yeah, in the real world, nuance exists, and and what is important in a lens. I'm huge, as you know, in looking at, when I'm buying my own gear, at looking at the balance between sharpness and the quality of the autofocus zones. Because ultimately, the impression of an image visually, and we are in a visual field, is really dictated by both of those concerns, not just image sharpness. And it's harder sometimes to measure the autofocus quality or the bokeh of a lens That said, that balance of bokeh to sharpness is what catches eyes. And if you're a working photographer, what's important is the images catch the eyes of the, and this is where I'm loving so many of the new Z mount lenses, because traditionally, and again, you can, feel free to scream at me when I say this, but traditionally in variable aperture zooms, one thing that took a hit, and I'm referring here to the 100 to 400, in previous versions or similar lenses, the thing that took a hit was not so much the sharpness, but the quality of the out of focus zones. And some people may look by it, but then when they look by that concept, but then when they see an image shot with a lens with a great out of focus zone, they go, wow, that's a great image. And historically, variable aperture zooms haven't had it. The 100 to 400 has got great quality out of focus zones. And for that matter, the 24 to 120, as much as on a shorter focal length zoom lens, you get a chance to really isolate your subject, it still has very good bokeh. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I'll kind of leave this as a teaser for a lot of people, because I think you and I could go down this rabbit hole of talking about, well, how does the Z70-200 f2.8 compare when used with a teleconverter against the Z100 to 400? So we could talk for a long time. So I'll leave some of those longer discussion points for when we do our YouTube live stream at the third-ish week of February. So everybody, if you're curious about topics like that, if you want to see Brad and I go down that rabbit hole, make sure you go and tune in a couple weeks. Check his blog, check our social. We are going to have it out there. So I think we'll even have an Eventbrite for it. I'm not 100% sure yet, but there will definitely be ways for you to find this topic. Go and ask Brad, ask me your questions. So Brad, I'm going to say on behalf of all of our viewers, thank you very much for coming back onto Nikon TV. It's always great to kind of hear your insight on the products, because like I said, it isn't just sensationalistic. You're not out there just to try and throw people one way or the other. You kind of try and give the facts as much as you know them in the examples, in the situations you've shot them in, but you let everybody else kind of make up their own mind. So I really appreciate that. That's why I love having you on here. So I'll say thank you very much for coming on, and we'll see everybody hopefully third week of February. Talk to you later, Brad.
Yep, thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
Well, thanks very much, Brad. As always, that was a fantastic interview. So as I mentioned with Brad, if anybody wants to go and tune in a couple weeks' time when we do our live stream, definitely go and make sure you check out Brad's blog, check out our Nikon social. We are going to make sure that you have the ability to jump on and ask myself and ask Brad our questions. So what I will sign off with is saying, if you guys have any other questions about the 28 to 75, about the Z 400mm, throw those in the comments below. And what I'm curious about is, what do you guys want the next Nikon TV episode to be about? I have it in my head that I'm planning maybe for the future to do one where I talk about different lenses, not necessarily specific Nikon lenses, but overall portrait lenses. Now, we all know that there's many different focal lengths out there. We have 24, 35, 50, 85, 105. We have the 70 to 200 that goes up to 200. Why would you want to go and use one focal length over another for portraiture? Maybe you guys are curious about that. If you are, write that in the comments below, because I take my direct feedback from you guys about what I want my next episodes because I want to make sure that it's something you guys are actually interested in. So tell me in the comments below what you want the next episodes to be about, and I'll make sure I listen, and we'll jot it down if you give me multiple options that I can go and do throughout the entire year. So thank you guys very much for joining me. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk with Brad. Hopefully you enjoyed the techie information about the new lenses. And until the next episode, stay safe.